There is a certain kind of laughter that doesn't come from joy. It comes from certainty, from believing you are untouchable. At 74, I had heard that laugh before in boardrooms, on job sites, in places where men measured worth by volume and control. I never expected to hear it directed at me and my own family, at a dinner table I once believed symbolized safety. The house looked perfect that evening. Warm lights reflected off polished floors, the kind of glow meant to suggest success and comfort. Anyone walking past the windows would have seen a stable American family settling in for dinner. What they wouldn't have seen was how easily dignity can be stripped without raising a voice. I sat at the table quietly, my posture straight, my hands resting calmly in front of me. Across from me sat my daughter's husband, relaxed, confident, leaning back as if the room itself belonged to him. He spoke loudly, comfortably, filling the space with stories about work, about people he managed, about decisions he made. He enjoyed being heard. He always had. At some point, the conversation turned to something local, an issue I had dealt with years earlier, back when my experience actually shaped outcomes. I offered a simple comment, not advice, not correction, just perspective. The moment the words left my mouth, I felt it, the shift, the pause. Then he laughed. It wasn't nervous. It wasn't surprised. It was dismissive. He leaned back, smiling, shaking his head slightly like I had said something ridiculous. "That's one way to see it," he said, amusement clear in his voice. The room went quiet. My daughter froze. I watched her eyes drop to her plate. She didn't speak. That silence landed harder than the laughter itself. I met his eyes calmly. "Experience has a way of seeing patterns," I said evenly. That only amused him more. "Sure," he replied, nodding slowly. Things worked differently back then. Back then, two words meant to erase decades of work, sacrifice, and judgment. He returned to his meal satisfied, already convinced the moment had passed. Conversation resumed without me. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, not anger, but recognition. This wasn't a mistake, it was permission taken. I stayed quiet for the rest of dinner, not because I was defeated, but because I understood something important. Men like him mistake reaction for relevance. Calm unsettles them far more than confrontation. When the meal ended, I excused myself. No one stopped me. No one asked if I was all right. In my room, I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at walls that once held family photos before they were quietly removed because they didn't fit the look anymore. I thought about how easily people forget who built the ground they stand on. Inside an old cabinet was a thin leather file I hadn't touched in years. I pulled it out slowly. My hands were steady. Inside were documents that didn't laugh, deeds, legal records, all written with clarity and intention, proof that authority doesn't announce itself until it needs to. He treated me like a joke because he believed proximity had given him power. He believed confidence replaced ownership. He believed silence meant weakness. What he didn't know was that a meeting was already scheduled. That a lawyer had already reviewed the file. That the authority he mocked had never left. It had simply been waiting. That night, as his laughter echoed faintly down the hallway, I lay back and stared at the ceiling, not angry, not hurt, certain. Because when the lawyer opened that file, laughter would no longer decide who held power. After that dinner, the laughter never returned, but its effects settled into the house like dust you can't quite clean away. He moved differently now, with ease, with certainty, as if something had been settled in his favor. The joke had done its job. In his mind, hierarchy had been established, and my silence had confirmed it. Every interaction that followed carried that assumption. Mornings became colder without anyone raising their voice. I woke early, as I always had, and moved through the kitchen while the house was still quiet. When he appeared later, conversations happened over me rather than with me. Plans were discussed as if I were already absent. If I spoke, he redirected the topic or responded without looking at me. It wasn't anger, it was dismissal, practiced and precise. He began correcting me casually. If I mentioned something I'd read, he waved it off as outdated. If I offered an opinion, he reframed it as nostalgia. Once, when I suggested a repair based on my familiarity with the house, he smiled and said he preferred professionals now. The implication was clear. Experience had an expiration date and mine had passed. My daughter noticed the shift. I could see it in the way she hesitated before speaking, in the way she watched him carefully when he addressed me, but she said nothing. Silence had become her strategy for keeping peace, even if it meant letting discomfort settle elsewhere. I understood her choice, even as it hurt. She was balancing stability against truth, and stability was winning. One afternoon, he stood in the living room speaking on the phone, his voice confident and unguarded. He talked about assets, about leverage, about how some people hold on too long and need help being realistic. He didn't lower his voice when he noticed me sitting nearby. He glanced at me briefly, then turned away, continuing as if I were furniture. When the call ended, he smiled, faintly satisfied. Men like him mistake comfort for control. At dinner that night, he dominated the conversation entirely. He talked about changes he wanted to make, about rearranging rooms, about how the house needed to reflect the future. He referred to it as his place without hesitation. Each time he said it, my daughter's shoulders tensed slightly, but she didn't correct him. Neither did I. Silence, once again, worked in my favor. At one point, he looked directly at me and said, almost kindly, that things move fast now and people have to keep up or get left behind. His tone suggested concern, but his eyes carried certainty. He believed he was explaining reality to me. I told him calmly that I had kept up longer than he thought. He smiled indulgently, the way someone humors a stubborn child. That was when I understood fully that he no longer saw me as part of the household's future. I was a situation to be managed, a presence to be phased out politely once timing allowed. And because he believed that, he stopped hiding his intentions. Pamphlets appeared on the counter about downsizing later in life. Articles about aging parents and difficult transitions were left open where I could see them. Comments about timelines slipped into conversation more often, framed as concern rather than command. Late one night, my daughter finally spoke to me about it. Her voice was quiet, apologetic, heavy with exhaustion. She said he was worried about stability, about what made sense long term. She said he didn't mean to be disrespectful. She said she hoped I understood. I told her I did because explaining the truth felt heavier than carrying the hurt. Silence had become our shared language, though for very different reasons. That night, alone in my room, I opened the leather file again. I went through every document slowly, carefully, not with anger but with precision. Ownership was clear, intent unmistakable, authority intact. Everything he relied on existed only because I had allowed it to. His confidence rested entirely on assumptions he had never bothered to confirm. The next morning I made several quiet calls, professional, measured, conversations with people who knew exactly who I was and what I controlled. No one laughed, no one interrupted. No one questioned my relevance. When I hung up, I felt grounded in a way I hadn't felt in months. Authority doesn't disappear, it waits. He believed treating me like a joke had settled everything. He believed confidence was the same as power. He believed silence meant weakness. What he didn't know was that power doesn't argue, it documents. And the file he had never asked about was already moving closer to the moment when laughter would no longer protect him. By the third week, his behavior no longer felt experimental. It felt settled. The joke had hardened into policy. He moved through the house with the comfort of a man who believed permission was no longer required, who believed presence alone granted authority. The way he spoke, the way he decided, the way he occupied space all carried the same quiet message. This was his world now, and I was simply occupying a corner of it until circumstances removed me. Stopped acknowledging me unless it was unavoidable. When I entered a room, conversations continued without pause, as if my presence had no effect on the flow of things. If I spoke, he responded without looking at me or redirected the conversation entirely. Sometimes he didn't respond at all. It wasn't overt cruelty, it was more efficient than that. It was erasure. And erasure, I learned, is how people justify treating others like jokes. The house itself began to change under his confidence. Furniture was shifted without discussion. Cabinets reorganized, small personal items quietly relocated. He talked openly about renovations, about improving functionality, about making the space reflect who we are now. Each decision reinforced the same belief: the past no longer mattered, and neither did the man who built it. He spoke about the future as if it were already written, and in that future I was absent. One afternoon, he laid out papers across the living room table and called me over with a casual wave of his hand. Bills, statements, projected expenses. He explained the numbers slowly, carefully, as though I had never balanced a checkbook or planned for long-term stability in my life. He pointed to rising costs, responsibilities, and then said it wasn't realistic for one person to carry everything alone forever. He framed it as concern, but his eyes revealed the truth. This wasn't about sharing a burden, it was about asserting control. I listened without interruption. When he finished, he waited, expecting discomfort, explanation, maybe even fear. Instead, I thanked him for the transparency and told him I appreciated being informed. The response unsettled him. Calm has a way of disrupting people who rely on pressure. For a moment, his confidence wavered. Then it returned stronger because he mistook restraint for agreement. That evening, my daughter barely met my eyes. She moved through the house quietly, her exhaustion visible in every step. Later, she spoke to me in the kitchen, her voice low, apologetic, careful not to provoke conflict. She said he was just trying to plan ahead, that he worried about stability, that he wanted clarity for the future. She didn't say where I fit into that clarity. She didn't need to. I told her I understood because explaining the truth felt heavier than absorbing the hurt. That night, alone in my room, I opened the leather file again. I didn't skim, I didn't rush. I read every document slowly, deliberately: ownership, conditions, protections, the will. Everything was exactly where it should be. Everything was intentional. The authority he believed he had claimed was never offered. He had built his confidence on proximity, not permission, and proximity has never been the same as power. The next morning, I made several quiet calls. The kind of calls that don't announce themselves. Conversations with people who knew exactly who I was, exactly what I controlled, and exactly why I was calling. No one laughed, no one questioned my relevance. No one spoke over me. When I hung up, I felt something solid return to me, a reminder that authority doesn't vanish just because someone stops acknowledging it. A few days later, he mentioned casually that a lawyer would be stopping by to review some things. He said it like a courtesy, like a favor. My daughter looked surprised, then uneasy. I said nothing. Silence once again worked in my favor. That night, lying awake, I thought about how men like him mistake unchecked behavior for legitimacy. How they believe that if no one stops them, they must be right. He believed treating me like a joke had diminished me. He believed laughter had shifted power. He believed the house was already his. What he didn't realize was that power is not taken through confidence. It is confirmed through documentation. And the legal file he had never asked about was already positioned to turn every assumption he had into silence. The day the lawyer arrived did not feel dramatic at first. There were no raised voices, no warnings, no tension obvious enough to alarm anyone outside the house. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind where sunlight filters through the windows and time seems unimportant. That normalcy was what made everything that followed impossible to undo. My son-in-law greeted the lawyer with practiced confidence, shaking his hand firmly, smiling like a man expecting validation. He believed this meeting existed to formalize what he already assumed was his, I watched quietly, saying nothing, letting his certainty build its own weight. We sat in the living room where so many decisions had been made without me. He leaned back comfortably, arms crossed, posture relaxed. My daughter sat beside him, tense, her unease visible now that something official had entered the space. I sat across from them, composed, hands resting calmly, my silence no longer passive but chosen. The lawyer opened his briefcase and removed a thick legal file. The sound of paper sliding against paper cut through the room more sharply than any argument ever could. The lawyer began reading in a steady, neutral voice: dates, transactions, ownership records. At first, my son-in-law barely listened. He glanced at his phone, then slowly put it down as the words failed to match his expectations. His posture shifted, his confidence faltered. When the lawyer clearly stated that the house had been purchased outright decades earlier, his head snapped up. He laughed once reflexively, the same laugh he had used at the dinner table, but this time it sounded thin and uncertain. He said there must be some mistake. The lawyer did not respond. He continued reading: transfer conditions, legal protections. Boundaries established long before my son-in-law had ever entered this family. With each sentence, the space he occupied in his own mind began to shrink. My daughter's breathing changed beside him. I could hear it. She turned toward me slowly, disbelief and realization colliding in her expression. She looked at the documents, then at me, finally understanding what my silence had been protecting. I met her eyes and nodded once. Nothing more was needed. My son-in-law interrupted, his voice sharper now, insisting none of this made sense, insisting he would have known. The lawyer finally looked up and explained calmly that assumptions do not alter legal reality. He resumed reading without emotion, then the will was introduced. The lawyer's tone did not change as he explained its terms: assets, conditions, intent, the house, the absence of a name that expected to be there. The color drained from my son-in-law's face. His mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time since I had known him, he had nothing prepared, no confidence, no dismissal, no laughter. My daughter stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor, asking why I had never told her. I told her quietly that I wanted her life built on respect, not leverage, and that I never believed silence would be mistaken for weakness. Her eyes filled not with anger but with understanding. I stood then, not to dominate the room but to reclaim it. I told him calmly that he had mistaken patience for weakness and proximity for ownership. I told him authority does not come from volume or mockery. It comes from truth, documented and undeniable. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The lawyer closed the file. The sound was final. In that moment, the joke ended completely, and the man who once laughed could no longer meet my eyes. After the lawyer left, the house did not erupt into chaos. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, no door slammed in anger. Instead, a deep, unfamiliar silence settled over everything, heavier than any argument ever could be. The truth had been spoken, documented, and acknowledged, and now it occupied the space where confidence once lived. Power once exposed no longer needed to perform. My son-in-law remained seated long after the meeting ended. His posture had collapsed inward, shoulders rounded, hands resting uselessly on his knees. The man who once laughed when I spoke now avoided my eyes entirely. His authority had not been taken from him by force. It had simply dissolved under the weight of reality. Laughter had never made him powerful. It had only masked how little he truly controlled. My daughter stood near the window, arms folded tightly around herself, staring out at the quiet street. When she finally turned toward me, her face held something deeper than shock. It was recognition. She apologized then, not hurriedly, not defensively, but slowly, as if each word carried years of regret. She apologized for her silence, for choosing comfort over courage, for letting me be diminished in the name of peace. I told her forgiveness did not require justification. Understanding had arrived, and that mattered more than blame. Later, when the house was quieter, my son-in-law tried to speak to me. His voice was careful now, stripped of arrogance, weighed down by embarrassment. He spoke about pressure, about responsibility, about never realizing how things truly stood. I listened without interruption, not because his explanation mattered, but because listening no longer cost me anything. When he finished, I told him calmly that respect does not begin after consequences. It begins long before entitlement feels safe. Whether he learned that lesson was not mine to decide. Life inside the house changed after that day, not suddenly but unmistakably. Conversations slowed, assumptions disappeared. He stopped declaring and started asking. He waited, he listened. The man who once treated me like a joke now measured his words in my presence, not out of fear but out of awareness. Truth has a way of doing that. In the weeks that followed, practical decisions were made quietly. No ultimatums, no forced endings. My daughter needed time to understand what her life looked like without illusions holding it together. I needed peace. For the first time in a long while, both were possible. I moved through the house without shrinking myself. I spoke when I wished. I stayed silent when I chose. The difference was control. I still wake early. I still drink my coffee by the window as the neighborhood comes alive. People greet me the same way they always have, with respect that was never tied to property or authority. The only thing that changed was inside me. I no longer questioned my worth. I no longer mistook patience for weakness. The legal file was never about revenge. It was about clarity, about boundaries, about reminding everyone, including myself, that dignity does not expire with age. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand acknowledgement. I let the truth stand on its own, and when it did, the joke was over.